This is Art Television.
Coming up, State of Business, sponsored by...
Manage all your SLT Mobitel services through the MySLT app.
IWS Aviation.
Hello there, you're watching our television. This is State of Business with me, Pamudha Katugambala. Stay tuned as we bring you the most up-to-date highlights of the day. Now first, let's have a look at today's headlines. The central bank relaxes the mandatory requirement on earnings conversion. Sri Lanka to benefit from new British trade scheme. Welcome back. Now let's have a detailed look at the stories. Now, to encourage service exporters to repatriate export proceeds, the Central Bank of Sri Lanka has withdrawn the mandatory requirement to convert service export receipts or proceeds. This withdrawal applies to receipts or proceeds that are received in Sri Lanka on or after 12 August 2022. Service exporters may use repatriated export proceeds for permitted purposes. However, the mandatory requirement to repatriate proceeds of service exports within 180 days from the date of provision of services remains unchanged. According to information reported by banks, during the first 6 months of 2022, a total of $1,533 million has been received as service exports receipts, of which $406 million has been converted to Sri Lankan rupees. The highest monthly service export proceeds of $324 million were received in March 2022. During discussions with representatives of services exporters, they have highlighted the potential to further enhance export receipts. Exporters are encouraged to bring in all export proceeds to the country at this time of need, while taking note of the mandatory requirement to receive such proceeds within 180 days. The central bank has intensified monitoring on compliance with the relevant requirements with respect to exporters and authorized dealers. Further information on the relaxation may be obtained by referring to the repatriation of export proceeds into Sri Lanka Rules No. 2 of 2022 as published in the Gazette Extraordinary No. 2292/50 dated 12 August 2022. This document is accessible through www.dfe.lk. Meanwhile, British State Minister for South Asia, United Nations and the Commonwealth, Lord Tariq Ahmad, assured that the UK looks forward to working with President Ranil Wickremesinghe's administration. The British government extends this cooperation with the aim of resolving economic and social issues. Prime Minister Dinesh Gunawardena, over a recent telephone conversation, briefed British State Minister Lord Tariq Ahmad about economic, social and political challenges and the government's short, medium and long-term solutions. Lord Ahmad assured the United Kingdom's support for these measures. Meanwhile, the UK is reshaping trade with 65 developing countries, including Sri Lanka, through a new trading framework, the Developing Countries Trading Scheme. The scheme will be one of the most generous sets of trading references of any country in the world, helping to grow trade, boost jobs and drive economic growth. The new scheme will replace the UK Generalised Scheme of Preferences and will come into force in early 2023. Overall, the total trade between the UK and Sri Lanka each year is around £1.4 billion. Sri Lankan goods which benefit most from the scheme include exports to the UK of baby clothes, t-shirts and vests, which receive a reduction of 12 percentage points in import duty. The new scheme replaces the UK Generalised Scheme of Preferences and simplifies rules of origin for least developed countries, reduces tariffs, revises how goods graduate and simplifies requirements to access enhanced tariffs. The Developing Countries Trading Scheme retains existing powers to suspend a country on the grounds of human rights and labour rights violations and broadens these powers to include violations in relation to anti-corruption, climate change and environment conventions. Now, the United Nations Sustainable Development Cooperation Framework 2023-2027 was launched today by the Government of Sri Lanka and the United Nations in Sri Lanka. The cooperation framework will guide the work of UN agencies, funds and programs for the next 5 years. The UNSDCF will support Sri Lanka to accelerate actions toward the achievement of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. The cooperation framework gives primacy to accelerating actions to ensure a rapid recovery from the economic crisis, along with the impact of COVID-19, prioritizing support to revitalize the economy and economic activities, social services, decent employment, social cohesion, and health and well-being for all people in Sri Lanka. The UNSDCF will be funded through core budget allocations of an estimated $60 million in addition to approximately $325 million through other resources spread across the 5-year period of implementation. The UNSDCF was co-signed by the Secretary to the Treasury Mahinda Sirivardana and UN President Coordinator in Sri Lanka Hannah Singha Hamdi. The Secretary to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Ms. Aruni Vijayawardena, and the Regional Director for Asia and the Pacific of the UN Development Coordination Office, David McLachlan-Carr, also graced the signing ceremony. Speaking at the event, the UN Resident Coordinator in Sri Lanka, Hannah Singha Hamdi, commented that this cooperation framework is mutually owned and anchored in national development priorities, the 2030 Agenda, and the principles of the UN Charter.
This document gives primacy to acceleration action to ensure a rapid recovery from the economic crisis along with the impact of COVID-19. So in the next 5 years, the UN support will look to support the government to revitalize the economy and economic activities, ensure access to quality of social services and to decent employment, pursue social cohesion, and promote an improved health and lifelong well-being for all the people of Sri Lanka. This document is mutually owned and anchored in the national development priorities and the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and the principles for the UN Charter. It is anchored in inclusive and equitable human development and well-being, the resilient and green recovery and growth for shared prosperity and environmental sustainability. Third is the social cohesion and inclusive governance and justice. And the fourth, that is both mainstreaming and as a priority itself, gender equality. Furthermore, all UN program cooperation and support will be anchored in the human rights and non-discrimination and ensuring no one is left behind.
See you soon with more stories after a short break.
More data when you stay and use more. Data Bow One, data Bow One.
A non-stop journey with Data Bow One from SLT Mobitel Home Broadband.
Welcome back. You're watching State of Business. Now, Sri Lanka's economic crisis is driving millions of people into poverty, jeopardizing their rights to health, education and an adequate standard of living. Human Rights Watch expressed these views in a publication released today. The United Nations estimates that 5.7 million people in Sri Lanka need humanitarian assistance, with 4.9 million, 22% of the population, being food insecure, meaning they do not have consistent access to adequate, nutritious food. International financing institutions and governments that hold Sri Lanka's debt or are involved in negotiations around debt restructuring have an international legal obligation to act to protect human rights in situations of economic crisis. Private creditors have a responsibility under the United Nations guiding principles on business and human rights to address adverse human rights impacts with which they are involved. The Human Rights Watch states that the following urgent steps are needed to address Sri Lanka's economic crisis. Sri Lanka needs to establish a new social protection system that is both adequate to protect everyone's right from the effects of the economic crisis and designed to prevent mismanagement and corruption with a view toward universal coverage. The nation must adequately fund the public health and education systems. The government should ensure that any new tax measures, including those introduced in an IMF program, are progressive and do not risk further eroding economic rights. Measures can include renegotiating contracts with foreign investors that pay little or no taxes, increasing corporate taxes, increasing income taxes for the wealthiest Sri Lankans, or a wealth tax. To address corruption and uphold the rule of law, the government should commit to adopting robust anti-corruption measures based on previous proposals with appropriate public scrutiny. The country should enact procurement legislation requiring open bidding for government contracts. The nation should rejoin the Stolen Assets Recovery Initiative, a joint program of the World Bank and the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime. Meanwhile, Sri Lanka's major foreign creditors should restructure their debt to mitigate the adverse human rights impacts of Sri Lanka's economic crisis. Now, Canada and Sri Lanka recently signed a Memorandum of Understanding to implement the WUSC Volunteer Cooperation Programme 2020 to 2027. The MOU was signed by the High Commissioner of Canada to Sri Lanka, David McKinnon, and Secretary to the Ministry of Finance, Economic Stabilisation and National Policies, Mahinda Sirivardhana. Funded by Global Affairs Canada, the innovative Global Networks for Inclusion and Equality project is a volunteer program spanning over 9 countries, including Sri Lanka. This 7-year initiative is implemented by the World University Service of Canada. It will support local partners to implement initiatives and provide services for poor and marginalized youth, particularly young women, in a sustainable, innovative and inclusive manner. WUSC brings more than 3 decades of participation in Sri Lanka's development as part of Canada's enduring commitment to building a prosperous and inclusive Sri Lanka. The IGNI+E project in Sri Lanka will support government, non-governmental, private and social enterprise sectors by engaging and harnessing the knowledge and expertise of qualified Canadian volunteers. 18 Sri Lankan volunteers will also be selected to support local partners in the project. 2 of the Sri Lankan volunteers will participate in a workshop in Canada on green entrepreneurship and gender lens investment. Their visit will include meetings with think tanks and exposure to business incubators and accelerators supporting women entrepreneurs working on climate initiatives in Canada. At the signing of the MOU, High Commissioner McKinnon commented that the program will contribute to sustainable economic growth in Sri Lanka and foster closer relations between the 2 countries. He also stressed that the IGNI+E project will bring valued technical assistance and create opportunities for enhanced cooperation between the Canadian and Sri Lankan participants. Meanwhile, Moody's Investor Services says that it has been a rocky start for the Asia-Pacific economy to this year. The delayed opening of economies following the Omicron wave of COVID-19 last year caused a recovery in the region to lag behind Europe, the US and elsewhere. Russia's invasion of Ukraine and China's zero-COVID policy created supply chain disruptions leading to inflation of energy and food prices. Most central banks reacted with rising interest rates. China's weakness in domestic demand caused by the downturn of its property development sector, its shifting regulatory environment, and the uncertain timing and severity of its zero-COVID policy had slowed China's growth and reduced trade flows. South and Southeast states have faced the greatest risk from outbursts of inflation. This could slow local demand for goods and services, including housing. Japan, South Korea and Taiwan are more highly exposed to further supply chain disruptions from China for electronics and components, while a decline in commodity prices faster than expected would dampen economies of Australia, Indonesia and Malaysia. Among high inflation countries in the South Asian region, only India's consumer price index rise has moderated, coming in below 7% over the year in July. Elsewhere, inflation is still rising, with higher rates for the food and energy components of consumer price index. Global crude oil prices peaked in the second quarter, with Brent crude below $100 per barrel and is expected to fall further as some countries release reserves. Dollar strength, however, could offset the near-term price impact for economies in the Asia-Pacific region. Thus, for the region, inflation is expected to ease modestly in the second half of the year. Any stress on transport or supply chains, however, should slow the improvement for the food price component of inflation. A principal factor in China's weak domestic economy has been identified as the faltering housing market. Stay tuned for stock updates.
to your work and learn targets. Get 30 GB Meet Lite for just 195 rupees and 100 GB Meet Max for 490 rupees. Log on to My SLT app to activate.
Welcome back. This is State of Business. And now stock updates. Trading at Colombo Stock Exchange ended on negative notes today. The Osha Price Index dropped 118.18 points to close at 8,968.06, and the S&P SL 200 dropped 56.92 points to close at 2,980.67. The turnover was 3.7 billion rupees and over 129 million shares were traded. Coming up next are Forex rates. Well, that's a wrap from today's edition of State of Business. See you tomorrow with State of Business at the usual time. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.